All right, folks, I've got 3:02, so we will go ahead and get started. As I said, thank you so much for joining today's webinar. My name is Caitlin Snyder. I am a Policy and Research Associate here at the National Housing Conference. So before we dive into our presentation, I have a few policy and NHC updates that I just want to share with everyone. And so we'll start with appropriations. Last week, the House THUD Appropriations Subcommittee released the FY 2019 bill, and they favorably reported that bill to the full Appropriations Committee with no amendments. The full Appropriations Committee will mark up that bill tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. In terms of what's in the bill, it provides $941 million more than the FY18 levels. It's still not enough to cover all of the contracts that are in the bill from last year, but the increase is genuinely a good thing. On to the next one. The administration released its rescission proposal last week. The rescission proposal included $41 million from the Public Housing Capital Fund, $151 million from Treasury's Capital Magnet Fund, and $40 million from USDA rental assistance. NHC led a sign-on letter asking members of Congress to oppose those rescissions. The Senate is unlikely to pass the rescissions package. There's debate on whether or not they need a 50 or 60 vote threshold, and that debate is still ongoing. We're hoping that they do vote to kill the package because if Congress doesn't vote on these funds, they'll be frozen for 45 legislative days, meaning these agencies won't be able to spend this money until the fall with the congressional calendar. So we're hoping they do take action, and they take action to vote down this package instead of just kind of letting it die on its own. And then in terms of the Federal Housing Administration, we heard last week from Senator McConnell's office that the Senate is hoping to vote on Brian Montgomery's nomination as commissioner of FHA before the Memorial Day recess. That vote is looking seemingly unlikely as we approach that recess. So it could happen this week, but it's more likely to happen next week. So stay tuned for more details. And then finally, I just want to remind folks that comments for the Federal Housing Finance Agency's Affordable Housing Program proposed rule are due on June 12th. So you've got a little bit of time to still get those in. And then in terms of NHC updates, I wanted to let folks know that we recently launched an Opportunity Zones Task Force. Our next meeting will be on Tuesday, May 29th at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. This task force is for NHC members only, and we're looking at kind of the opportunity zones as Treasury goes through their rulemaking process and what, if any, statutory changes are needed to this program. So if you'd like to be added to the distribution list, you can reach out to me and I'll make sure to include them in the notes. And with that, I want to move on to today's agenda. So first we'll hear from Vincent Raina with the University of Pennsylvania, who will talk about his study, Safety Net, ? The use of vouchers when a place-based rental subsidy ends. Then we'll turn it over to Ellen Laurie Hoffman and Laura Abernathy with the National Housing Trust, and they'll discuss their preservation working group that NHT coordinates, as well as state and local preservation strategies. Before I hand it over, I just wanted to mention questions and technical difficulties. Throughout the webinar, you can submit questions through the question box, and we'll take them at the end of the webinar, but please feel free to submit them throughout the presentation. And with that, I will hand it over to Vincent.
Great. First, I want to say thank you very much for having me here today. As a researcher, one of my hopes and goals is for my research to make it to practitioners and thought leaders in the space. And so hopefully some of the stuff I'm presenting today will prove beneficial for the work you all are doing and will spur further questions and ways for us to engage with each other. Today I'm presenting a paper that's soon to be published in a journal called Urban Studies that is in conjunction with Ben Winter, who's now the housing policy specialist for the Office of Mayor Garcetti. But this project actually started long before his time in the mayor's office when he was at PD&R at HUD. and he is kind of the mastermind who really built the data set that allowed us to actually do this, take part in this research project. So before I jump into the research itself, I want to provide an overview of a program you probably all know well, and so this is very redundant for some of you, but it's kind of important to ground it in this. So, you know, as we know, the project-based Section 8 program and the variations of it began in 1974. It subsidized private owners to develop or rehab housing, and those owners then agreed to keep those, enter a housing assistance payment contract with HUD and keep those units affordable for a fixed period of time. Over 1.2 million units were developed through this program. By virtue of kind of being privately owned and entering these HAB contracts, owners at some point have the option to exit the program. There's two ways that properties and units can exit the program. One is through an owner opting out of the program. When their contract comes to an end, owners have the renewal option, and at that point they could choose not to renew. The other option is if a building's in distress, HUD can actually essentially foreclose on the property, and naturally there also could be a foreclosure in the case of an issue with the mortgage itself. So there are opt-outs and there are terminations, both of which can lead to the contract ending and not being renewed. What's interesting about this program is that, you know, in the 90s, as many of you knew well, there was a first wave of properties that were becoming eligible for renewals, and there was fear of kind of a large wave of prop owners opting out of the program, and the implications this has for the tenants in the property. Tenants pay 30% of their income in rent, and HUD pays the difference between that 30% and the market rent for the unit, depending on, you know, how the owner increases those rents within HUD's limits. So naturally, if an owner opts out, that would pose a serious challenge to the tenants in these properties because the owner is choosing to leave these programs, not the tenants. So the tenant protection voucher was created in spirit and then formalized in the mid to late 90s. And what this essentially means is that when an owner opts out or HUD terminates the contract, tenants in these properties are offered a voucher as a form of tenant protection. It's a tenant protection voucher insofar as in the case of opt-outs, a tenant can use it to rent their existing unit in their property in theory, because what HUD does is it allows actually the voucher rent limit to go above traditional voucher rent limits, the maximum amount actually being at the discretion of the local HUD field office, with very loose parameters about what that maximum could be. But if a tenant chooses to move or has to move with the voucher, it becomes essentially a normal enhanced voucher, and it's no longer rather a normal housing choice voucher, so it's no longer enhanced. In the case of a termination, by virtue of the mortgage being or the building quality being poor and leading to a termination, tenants essentially have to move. So it's never really a tenant protection voucher, or it's never an enhanced voucher. It always is essentially a housing choice voucher that households use to move. So this paper is motivated by those dynamics in the program and this broader context of the fact that, as we all know well, the share of affordable private market rental units has decreased and rent burdens have consistently increased. There's increased demand for subsidized housing, while the number of properties where owners will be eligible to end their existing subsidy contracts will increase going forward. In a paper that I worked on for the Grounded Solution Network that's going to be coming out through the Lincoln Institute for Land Policy, I chronicle this kind of challenge going forward when we look at the number of potential expirations, potential exits, and if nothing else, the need for recapitalization going forward. There's a large scale of properties, not just in the project-based Section 8 program, but particularly in the low-income housing tax credit program, with properties approaching year 15 and year 30 that are going to be needing recapitalization and pose challenges to that stock. So what's interesting about this particular program is the tenant protection voucher is essentially one of the only safety net programs we have in our kind of affordable housing world at a federal level. And yet we know very little about what happens to households who live in Section 8 properties when an owner exits, well, when a subsidy contract ends. So what this research is trying to do is ask several questions. One, determine in these properties where a subsidy contract ends, how many households use their voucher? Do households who use their voucher to move? Do households use the voucher and move to lower poverty neighborhoods? And do these outcomes vary based on household demand, market supply, or household demographic factors? With the premise that these questions are all really important, not only for understanding what happens to households in these properties, but also to think more broadly about the utility of a voucher as a safety net vehicle. In theory, this is the kind of best case scenario, like I said, because this is a tenant protection that's in place, and in other programs there aren't such protections in place. So what this does is it builds on a lot of existing literature that you all probably know very well. Some about this notion of contract expirations and exits, and general research shows that properties are more likely to exit a subsidy program in areas with increasing price appreciation, rising rents, and improving neighborhood characteristics. What's really interesting is that a lot of the existing older place-based affordable housing units are in some neighborhoods that are much higher opportunity than even those accessed by a lot of voucher households and renters even more broadly, because of the way a lot of neighborhoods have changed compared to where these units were cited in the past and currently. This builds on existing literature about voucher use more broadly. So this means looking at how many households who were offered a voucher actually used the vouchers. There have been a lot of studies that have kind of looked at voucher use rates over time and barriers that households face when actually trying to use their voucher. A lot of these studies at this point are fairly old. And most of them were commissioned by HUD. Approximately 81% of households offered a voucher used it in 1993, according to a study that was done by Kenny and Finkel. That was an apt report. 69% did in 2000. Another apt report and a study by Schroeder, looking, I think, specifically at the MTO program, found that the Section 8 group, 60% used the voucher that they were offered. Voucher use often varies based on different characteristics, such as household demand for the voucher itself, market supply, and household demographics, which are some of the things we kind of explore a little further in this paper. Next, existing literature on voucher moves. Generally, evidence seems to suggest that with the traditional voucher, households delay moves until they receive a voucher. They move multiple times with their voucher and move to slightly lower poverty neighborhoods with each of those moves. So in this paper here, what we did is we constructed a national tenant level database with proprietary HUD data from 1996 to 2000. Basically, we identified every property where subsidy contract ended in the Section 8 program during that period. And then what we did is we, determined who lived in those properties and then layered on the voucher data to then see who in those expirations then used the voucher that they were offered. And then we can follow those voucher households over time to see kind of where they moved and what has changed over time. We combined that data with some data from the ACS to kind of get a sense of the markets, the local markets where this is happening, and also where households move. And so what we do is a general descriptive analysis first of looking at kind of use rates and moves. And then we test these with a series of models, basically looking at the odds of a household using a voucher, the odds of a household moving with their voucher, and then what those moves look like, particularly with respect to the poverty rate of the census tract in which they live. And what we're doing in these models is essentially controlling for household demand for the subsidy, market supply, and household demographics. And so we define household demand by basically how much we believe a household would actually demand the subsidy going forward. So, for instance, if the market rent for the unit's high, we would assume that a household would have higher demand for the subsidy because naturally the counterfactual of a unit without the subsidy is quite high for them. Similarly, a household who's low income, particularly the lowest income households, might have higher demand for the subsidy as well because they're more naturally sensitive to income shocks. That said, this is a population by virtue of qualifying for project-based Section 8 and then subsequently for vouchers who are very low income. So on average, the average household in our sample had an annual income somewhere usually ranging between $8,000 to $12,000, which is quite small. And then naturally based on household demographics. So in the ideal world, household demographics but for preferences maybe based on someone's life course wouldn't matter, but we know that there are structural barriers in housing markets. There's discrimination in housing markets. Housing units might be more difficult to find for elderly households who have a harder time navigating the private market, and people on more fixed income, not relying on wages, but maybe relying also just on Social Security and other things. Those represent potentially constraints that would affect someone's likelihood of maybe using and how they use the voucher. So going into the results, and this is all kind of a broad overview, and I'm happy to share the paper and discuss this in more detail with anyone who'd be interested. We find that only 48% of the households in these properties actually use the voucher that they are offered. So this was quite surprising because those who do not use their voucher lose over $400 per month in rental assistance, which is equivalent to 41% of their effective income. So this is a rather significant financial shock to these households because, again, the owner or HUD is terminating the contract. It's not the tenants in these properties. So there are naturally processes in place to make sure that tenants know that these things are going forward, but naturally those processes are in theory being met, but also we don't know how well they're being met, especially with varying capacity of field offices and varying support on the local level from kind of local organizations who might be working with these tenants or even know that a unit's about to expire. We generally find that those households with the highest rent, lowest income, those are dependents, and the Black or elderly head of household are associated with lower voucher use rates, and particularly elderly households have extremely low voucher use rates, even when controlling for other factors. So again, this is concerning because this means the households potentially with the most need for the subsidy are actually the people who are least likely to use it. We find that when we look at do households move, 56% of households who use their voucher move to another tract. Of those households who move, 72% move once, 21% move twice, and 7% move 3 or more times. We find that households with dependents and those where the head was older than 62 or Black had higher odds of moving 1 or more time. We use the 62-year age cutoff not because we personally think that 62 is old, but we were kind of following cutoff points for HUD in kind of some of their larger data sets. But that said, this means that the households who are also less likely to use the voucher, when they actually do use the voucher, they're the group that's more likely to move multiple times. Then when we look at do voucher households move to lower poverty neighborhoods, we find that the average poverty of a tract where a household lived where the contract ended was 26.8%. This naturally is smoothing out a lot of variation across these properties. But on the whole, households who moved to lower poverty neighborhoods. So consistent with existing literature on vouchers, these moves seem to be moves to slightly lower poverty neighborhoods. But controlling for moves, Black and Hispanic households were still associated with living in higher poverty tracts, while those with dependents were actually associated with living in slightly lower poverty tracts. So in bringing this all together, the general findings show that 52% of households in a property where the contract ends do not use a voucher and on average lose 41% of their effective income. One thing I will say here is that, in our regression models of looking at drivers we control for the public housing authority that's administering the voucher, this 48%, 52% non-use, 48% use is partially reflective of variation in use rates across public housing authorities, which is probably implementing the program quite differently at the local level. That said, 56% of households who use their voucher move, so this is across the whole sample. Moving is associated with lower tract level poverty rates. Those with the highest demand for a rental subsidy have lower odds of using it. So we talked about that a little earlier. households where the head is older than 62 are less likely to use a voucher and more likely to move multiple times. And households where the head is black are less likely to use a voucher, more likely to move multiple times, and are associated with a higher tract level poverty rate, controlling for those moves. One group that in the end, those with dependents have lower use rates are more likely to move, but it does seem that those with dependents are actually moving to slightly lower poverty tracks. So those who actually make it through those various hoops might be slightly better off, but again, that's a small fraction of the larger pool. So there's limitations of the study, right? So one challenge here generally is that we lose our counterfactual. What happens to those households do not use their voucher? We can't really tell that story here because they exit HUD's data sets. We can assume that a low-income household who's essentially losing 41% of their effective income and who is more likely to be elderly and face other kind of barriers with respects to income and access in the rental market are it'd be hard to make the case that they're not worse off, right? We can't show that here, but this is a very significant income shock by these households. One thing I'm doing in a subsequent paper is to try to get this control group back in. I focus on Los Angeles County, and I have a 14-year panel of every kid attending public school in the Los Angeles Unified School District. And what I do is I merge the database of opt-out or expirations with this school level data to essentially find every household with school-age kids in a subsidized property generally, but then also in a Section 8 property and a Section 8 property where the subsidy ends to look at the impact of this event on academic outcomes of kids. And there I have the group of people who don't use the voucher because I'm getting the whole population of kids in school in the LAUSD, and there's a high correlation between being low income and qualifying for Section 8 and going to public school in Los Angeles as opposed to going to private school. So what I'm trying to do is kind of trying to look at this event more broadly beyond just the voucher use and look at the impact of it on a broader set of outcomes. Overall, this paper, highlights a concerning reality, and naturally there's a hope of creating some recommendations about things we can do productively to address this. And one is naturally investing data to better understand which properties are at risk of losing subsidies, and this is something that the National Preservation Database does quite well and is increasingly important. Having those data alone isn't the only thing that's useful. Naturally, you need to use those data. And so in looking at some of the geographic variation of use rates, you find in a market like New York, which is a very constrained market, there are actually much higher use rates, and in places that where it seems like a voucher might be more easily used, there were lower use rates. And so part of this probably reflects the use of data to understand which properties are actually going forward, because I know in New York City, for instance, during this time, there was an active advocacy community that was working with these properties and tenants in these properties who are likely kind of helping with, one, people knowing their rights, but then two, people being able to use this tenant protection voucher, and also ensuring that HUD regulations and fair housing laws were actually being followed. Another thing this highlights, though, is this idea of, there's a conversation broadly, and I know that in the second half of this panel, we're going to be talking about preservation more broadly. When we think of preservation, meaning preserving the existing stock of subsidized housing and the affordability of those subsidized units, you're competing with the market. And insofar as you're competing with the market, that means that the market also could be absorbing aspects of growth and growth potential of an area, which makes it essentially hard to sometimes get the financing and justify the case for preserving a property when someone's willing to pay a much higher price. But in the case of these expirations, if we empirically can prove and show that there are what we would expect, which is serious negative repercussions of this event on tenants who live in these properties, and show across the host of metrics how these present kind of larger social welfare costs that get absorbed by those households and then kind of the city more broadly, then it makes the case for incorporating all these potential losses and calculating the amount of subsidy offered to actually preserve existing affordable housing. At the end of the day, when we're even in the case where units can't be preserved, and you know, a contract might end, you know, it points to the case of the fact that when we administer vouchers and tenant protections along these lines, is that we have to acknowledge the fact that there are various different factors that affect use rates and certain subpopulations that appear to be consistently more adversely affected by these kind of events. And therefore, when we talk about administering the vouchers and providing resources, really making sure that those groups that we know are more likely to be negatively affected by this are receiving additional support and protections. So that said, I'm going to stop there. Here's my email address. Like I said, the paper is going to be coming out in the near future in this journal Urban Studies, and they want me to do a blog post about it, but I'm happy to chat more broadly or generally about this, and I'm also open to other ideas and feedback that people might have about stuff here, because for me this is a part of a much broader agenda that I'm hoping will help inform and assist the work that you all, the good work that you all do every day. So thank you.
Thank you, Vincent. That was very helpful. And I want to remind folks to submit their questions through the chat box, and we will take them at the end of the presentation. So with that, we're going to turn it over to Laura and Ellen with the National Housing Trust.
Thanks, Caitlin. And this is Ellen Laurie Hoffman. I'm the Federal Policy Director here at the National Housing Trust. Are we controlling slides?
I believe so. Can you confirm, Caitlin, that you can see our slides?
Yes, they look great.
Okay, great. You want to move us to the next slide? So thank you for this opportunity, and I want to thank Vincent also for his research, which is very helpful. I just wanted to take a quick minute and talk about the National Housing Trust for any folks on the webinar that aren't familiar with us. We're a national nonprofit based here in Washington, D.C., and you can see our mission statement. We are focused on preserving existing affordable multifamily rental housing. And we do this through 3 lines of business, through policy work. Laura and I represent the federal and state and local policy work that we do. We also do real estate development and lending, and we pursue energy efficiency in all 3 lines of business. We can move on to the next slide. So as the Federal Policy Director at the Trust, I convene a national coalition called the National Preservation Working Group. And before I launch into explaining what PWG is all about, I just want to take a second. Vincent, I think, did a great job of explaining why we care about preservation and why tenant protection vouchers are so important. I just wanted to add a little bit of color to that. We are so focused on preservation here at NHT because, as Vincent mentioned, much of the subsidized rental housing that we currently have is at risk of loss due to expiring affordability periods. Over the next 10 years, 500, and this is not on the slide, so you just have to listen to this. Over the next 10 years, 530,000 rental properties with project-based rental assistance or project-based Section 8 will reach the end of their affordability periods, as will 478,000 properties with low-income housing tax credits and 136,000 properties with other subsidies. So we're going to lose a lot of affordable housing if we don't find a way to preserve it and keep it affordable. And as Vincent mentioned, properties in high rent areas are most vulnerable, most at risk to being converted to market rate rental housing or to condos. And when we talk about preservation, what we mean is preservation is when action is taken to ensure that the federal housing subsidy and low-income housing restrictions remain in place to preserve long-term housing affordability. Preservation, recapitalization of a property is usually combined with repairs to the property. Often during a preservation transaction, a property is purchased by a new owner who's committed to the long-term affordability of the property and is then renovated and managed along with those values. And we know that preservation is extremely cost-effective. Rehabbing an affordable apartment can cost 1/3 less than building a new one. It also protects the billions of taxpayer dollars that have already been invested in affordable rental housing. And through our work, the trust has seen that in distressed neighborhoods, preserving affordable housing can help revitalize an entire community. So we've been dedicated for over 25 years to preservation, and during those 25, I think almost all of those 25 years, we have led the Preservation Working Group, and it's been my privilege to lead it for the last 4 years. And as you can see on the slide, the Preservation Working Group is a national coalition of housing owners, developers, advocates, tenant associations, and state and local housing agencies dedicated to preserving affordable multifamily housing. It's really open to anyone that wants to participate. It's a very free and open coalition. We have monthly calls and we have quarterly meetings in Washington. Usually we convene for a day here at the Trust headquarters and talk about both federal legislation and regulatory changes that are relevant to preservation. We usually bring in folks from the administration, from HUD, to talk about what's going on. And on the second day of our meetings, we usually go to Capitol Hill. And for those who are interested, to meet with congressional staff, usually appropriators, sometimes the authorizing committees, which is the banking and House Financial Services committees. We disseminate information on an almost daily basis related to legislation and regulations that have to do with preservation, trying just to keep people up to date on what's going on. And again, we advocate for resources and legislation that support preservation before Congress, before the administration. So we'll do sign-on letters, we'll present testimony, we'll provide comments on regulatory rules. We work closely with the National Housing Conference, and with many of the members of the National Housing Conference are also members of PWG. If folks are interested in learning more, they're certainly welcome to reach out to me directly. Again, it's really open to anyone that wants to get involved, and our agenda is formed by the interests of the membership as well as whatever is actually happening in Washington. So that's just a quick overview on PWG, and I'm going to turn it to Laura to talk about state and local preservation strategies.
Great, thank you. Hi, I'm Laura Abernathy, also with the National Housing Trust. I'm the Director of State and Local Policy here. And I'm going to talk a bit about some of the innovative and effective approaches that we've seen on the local level to preserving existing affordable housing. So we heard from both Ellen and Vincent a lot about sort of the national scope of the problem. We heard some federal numbers about the housing crisis and the number of people affected. And it's absolutely true that the housing crisis and preserving our existing affordable housing is a national issue, but it is 100% a local challenge. So coming up with the creative, effective, and innovative solutions to solve the housing crisis and to preserving existing affordable housing very much rests with local cities, with states, with local jurisdictions. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about that. With that said, there's really no one-size-fits-all approach to local preservation. A program that I work with a lot is a federal program called the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program, which many of you may be familiar with. Part of what makes that program so effective is the ability of each state to set its own priorities. And what that program does is recognize that what California needs might, in terms of affordable housing, might very well be very different than what Kansas needs in terms of affordable housing, or what Florida needs or Rhode Island needs. So there's this inherent recognition that different communities have different needs around affordable housing. And that's what makes that program really strong. And when thinking about any preservation policy, that is absolutely true. Each community has its own set of challenges, as well as their own opportunities. So again, I just want to emphasize that there's no sort of one-size-fits-all magic bullet approach to a local preservation strategy. So I do want to lay out, though, a couple of key elements, sort of the framework to starting a preservation policy on the local level before I sort of dive into a couple of innovative approaches. So I have three listed here that I'll dive into a little bit deeper. First of all is sort of a strategic, comprehensive approach to preservation. Second, and we heard about this a little bit from Vincent already, is the need for data collection and analysis. And then third are policies and programs that address those specific needs. Again, these are strategies that we've seen work across the country in various communities of various types and sizes, but in each instance, they're tailored to the specific city or the specific state that has a certain need. So the first one that I want to talk about is the need for a local preservation collaborative. So later in this presentation, I'm going to talk a bit about some specific policies and even some laws that are really geared towards preservation. But the truth is that in order for any of those innovative and creative laws to really take effect and be successful, any community has to have a really deep commitment to preservation, and that comes from both the private and the public sector. So, we just heard Ellen talk about the National Preservation Working Group, and we've seen local versions of that, local preservation working groups or local preservation collaboratives be really effective across the country in both cities and states. And sort of the first step towards creating an effective preservation strategy. So I'm not going to go through each network that I have listed here on the screen, but I think this is a good resource for anyone that's interested in some effective local preservation collaboratives. But you'll see that in Colorado, Massachusetts, Portland, Oregon, Washington, D.C., Cook County, Illinois, and a number of others, the community has come together, both public sector government members and private sector members, for-profit developers, non-profit developers, advocates, et cetera, and have come together and at the very least sat at the table together to talk about the importance of preservation in their community. And communicating the importance of and need for preservation sounds like a really simple and maybe obvious first step, but we've seen time and time again how meaningful it really can be. We've heard somewhat anecdotally about communities where, they weren't sharing information. They didn't have a preservation collaborative. And so mission-minded, nonprofit, preservation-oriented developers were perhaps both bidding on the same property and driving up the cost and really making preservation harder for themselves and for each other, simply because they weren't talking to each other. So getting around the table with these stakeholders and talking about preservation, identifying the properties that are at risk, in some cases matching those properties with potential buyers, matching them with funding sources, et cetera, is a really effective, though perhaps basic first step to getting this done. So I do want to highlight the approach that is underway in Colorado, and it's the first one there on the table on the screen. So it's the Colorado Housing Preservation Network, and it's convened by the State Housing Finance Agency, CHAFA, and it's only, I think, maybe 2 or 3 years old. It's fairly new, and it was recognized by NCSHA, the National Council of State Housing Agencies, just last year as being the best of the best nationwide for preservation and rehabilitation initiatives. And in its first year alone, almost 5,000 affordable rental units were preserved by member organizations of the Colorado Network, Preservation Housing Network, excuse me. By coming together, by talking about these things, they can set priorities. We heard from both Ellen and Vincent about how there might be greater risk for losing affordable housing in markets that are really hot and have really high rental rates. And so these networks can come together and they can decide, look, maybe we can't preserve everything that we have out there, but let's prioritize what we do want to preserve. And maybe it's those communities where they're able to recognize really high rents and say, these are at greater risk. We have to preserve these now before the opportunity is lost. But again, Colorado's not the only one doing it. Massachusetts is doing it on a statewide level. Portland, DC are both doing it on a city level, and Cook County, Illinois on the county level. And so the next thing I want to talk about, and we heard about this from Vincent quite a bit actually, is the importance of having data. Again, this sounds somewhat simple, but if you don't know what it is that you're trying to preserve, how are you ever going to preserve it? So it's really important to have a clear picture of the existing affordable housing stock, and creating this database or an early warning system is often the first task that these local preservation collaboratives assign to themselves. They all come together at a table, they say, we all agree that preservation is really important, and before they can hit the ground running on preserving anything, they say, hold on, we don't even know what the stock looks like that we're trying to talk about. So that's often the first task that these collaboratives had, is setting up databases for themselves. So here you'll see just a screenshot I took from the National Housing Preservation Database, which is run by the National Low Income Housing Coalition. And Vincent talked about that as well. It's a great resource that provides data on the national level for every single state, city, zip code, congressional district. You can cut it in 1,000 different ways about existing affordable housing. You can look at different subsidy types, you can look at expiration dates, and you can get a sense of your community, however big or however small you decide to define that, about what's at risk. Unfortunately, the database only gives information for properties with federal subsidies, and as anyone working in local affordable housing knows, there's a number of local subsidies that are available as well, and this database doesn't capture that. So a number of communities, and this is just a couple of them, and they're certainly not an exhaustive list, have taken it upon themselves to enhance that data. So some states and communities are building their own databases to capture the existing affordable housing stock in their own communities. So the Florida Housing Data Clearinghouse is at the Schimberg Center for Housing Studies at the University of Florida. The Ohio Preservation Compact captures all of this data for Ohio. Preserve Oregon Housing is run by NOAA, the Network of Oregon Affordable Housers in Oregon. And it goes a step beyond the data that's provided by the National Low Income Housing Coalition by pulling in that local data and that local knowledge. Some of the databases, again, have been created by these local preservation collaboratives who are sending out surveys to owners to sort of try to collect some of this data to make it available. A question that we have heard time and time again from states or even cities struggling to gather this data is, once they have it, what do they do with it? This question of how public do they want this data to be is a really common one. So it's all publicly available data, but some of these sort of clearinghouses and databases are a little bit nervous about making the information that they've compiled too accessible, with the idea that if anyone has this information, anyone can start targeting these properties who may or may not be interested in preserving it. So that's something that has been asked a lot. I know that, again, to speak to the Colorado network, and I don't have them listed here, though they do have a database that they have since compiled. That's a question that they've struggled with a lot. How public do they want to make this data? And so that you're required, before you access that data, to sort of give them some information about who you are, how you intend to use that data, and then sign something before you access that as well. But all of these databases listed here, so again, Ohio, Minnesota, Oregon, New York, and Florida, all of these are public databases that you can access yourselves without having to go through anyone else. And so once you have, a clear sense of what that existing stock looks like through these databases, and once you've come together with other stakeholders in your community, again, whether public sector, private sector, or ideally a combination of the two, that's when you can really start to come up with approaches to solving whatever that local issue may be as it relates to preservation. So I mentioned briefly earlier that these collaboratives in some instances are taking the data from the databases, they're identifying specific properties, and they're matching them with potential preservation purchasers. And that's certainly one approach to preservation, but I want to talk briefly, with the little bit of time that we have left, about some of the more sort of formal and even legal mechanisms that communities are taking to address preservation. So you saw Portland there on one of the earlier slides where I listed preservation collaboratives, and they're worth mentioning here, again, for something that they did a number of years back, called the 11 by 13 Preservation Campaign. So it was a group of stakeholders, both public sector and private sector, in this collaborative form that I've been mentioning. and they identified 11 properties that totaled over 700 units, and they said, you know what, we're going to commit to identifying these 11 properties by 2013. So that's where they get the name 11 by 13. And so by identifying these very specific, tangible properties and sitting down and publicly committing to preserving them in the coming years, they were able to do that. And they did preserve all 13 properties. And it had a lot to do with, A, access to data and the ability to identify specific properties, as well as setting very specific, tangible goals that help them achieve that. Another one I want to run through quickly is DC's Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, also known as TOPA. So I'll talk, briefly after this about rights of first refusal that exist in a handful of communities across the country where if and when an affordable property is up for sale, the city or its designated partner may have the right to purchase it and preserve it. In DC, those rights go not to the city and not to their designated partner, but they actually go to the tenants. And as far as I know, it's the only law in the country that grants tenants that type of right. So it's an incredibly strong tenant right that we have here in DC, so that if you're living in a rental property and it's for sale, you as a tenant have the right to purchase that property before anyone else does. So the law itself is not necessarily designed as a preservation tool because it extends to all rental properties across the district, but it functions primarily as a preservation tool. So we see often in affordable multifamily rental housing, if an owner intends to sell it, the tenants have become incredibly sophisticated and savvy here in DC, and they come together, the tenants create a tenants group, and they put out RFAs, and they ask affordable housing developers to come back to them with a proposal, and essentially they're bidding for those tenants' rights. And so the tenants can then assign their rights to an affordable developer who can preserve that property so that all of the tenants can continue to live there. So this works really effectively in DC as a way to preserve existing properties. Ellen mentioned that in addition to policy and lending, NHT also has a real estate development arm, and many of the properties that we've preserved here in the district have come to us through tenants groups who are exercising their TOPA rights. So again, that's really the strongest tenant protection right that I know of that exists in the country. But other cities have preservation ordinances that take a very similar approach. So instead of assigning those right of first refusal rights to the tenants, they assign them to the city or their designated partner. So NHT works with some advocates and some policymakers in Denver a handful of years ago when they said, look, we have a preservation ordinance on the books. It has existed for quite a number of years, but they were seeing that they were losing a number of properties, and so they were worried that their preservation ordinance wasn't working quite as well as they had intended. So they came to us and said, how do we make this better? So we looked at preservation ordinances across the country, Chicago, Seattle, Portland. We looked at DC's TOPA law, and we came back to Denver with a series of recommendations. And so what Denver ended up doing is writing a law that includes that right of first refusal, such that if the owner of an affordable housing property is going to put that property up for sale, the city has the first chance to buy it. And Denver, like many cities, doesn't want to end up purchasing all of these properties. The law is written in a way that they can grant that right to their designated affordable housing development partner. So Denver, in this case, doesn't end up purchasing all of these properties, but they can help ensure that properties are preserved. And I do want to, something that isn't on this slide, but I should have included, was just a note about an online preservation catalog where the National Housing Trust keeps track of these policies and local preservation policies from across the country. Most of what you'll find on there is related to the low-income housing tax credit program, but these other innovative preservation policies are also up there. So that's called PrezCat, PREZCAT.org, because it is a preservation catalog. So that's where we get PrezCat. And then before we wrap up, I want to give Vincent a chance to chime in here too. You know, I was speaking very broadly about some of the very broad framework that we've seen around preservation across the country. And Vincent, I know that you have recently wrapped up some work in Philadelphia working on their preservation policies and plans. And so I'm wondering if you wanted to speak some about what that specific project has looked like, and, you know, maybe some of what I've talked about with both data and a preservation collaborative, maybe some of that is part of what Philadelphia either already has or maybe should think about implementing.
Thank you. Yeah, so I guess just building off what you said, the city of Philadelphia is very much in its early phases of thinking about its preservation challenges and opportunities. And to the city's credit, one of the things they've been doing is going through essentially a 2-year extensive pre-planning process before they develop their 10-year housing plan. And one of the stakeholder groups was convened by the local office of LISC. And LISC wanted to convene a group to talk about the potential challenges and opportunities around the preservation of existing subsidized housing. So what they did is they commissioned me to do a study around kind of national best practices and similarities and differences across sites that have active preservation strategies to help frame some of their thinking about this topic. And what, you know, my work found is exactly similar to kind of what you've been talking about here, and reinforces the need for a lot of the tools that you're talking about, not the least of which in the local context, LISC was playing this role of convener, right, and really kind of bringing in a broad group of stakeholders, both traditional subsidized housing developers, local nonprofits and CDCs, but also large private developers, city agencies, property managers, to kind of think of this more broadly, and actively engaging data tools that are developed locally, but also using the National Preservation Database to help frame what are the opportunities and challenges going forward. And so what they're doing right now is they've put forth kind of a set of recommendations that they're hoping and everyone believes will feed into the city's larger housing plan to have preservation be a specific goal, and to build on developing that kind of framework and structure to employ, I think, actively, proactively about preservation and develop programs around it. So in the interest of time, I'll stop there, but I think it was a really interesting process for me to see as a researcher coming in and engaging with them, because it very much follows a lot of the model that you were talking about and seeing more broadly nationally. And now we're at a point where we're hoping, or they're hoping that, you know, they see the fruits of their labor through the city's upcoming housing action plan.
Well, thank you so much.
Great. And
oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. This is Laura again. I was just going to say, you know, I think, you know, taking a really thoughtful approach like that, like you just described, Vincent, is so important, rather than just sort of cherry picking what works in other cities and saying, well, this works for that city, I guess we'll do the same thing. Really being thoughtful about what the unique challenges and opportunities are in Philadelphia, so that it's not just copying another city's law and hoping for the best, but it's really making sure that it best meets the needs of, in this case, Philadelphia. So really happy to hear that. But back to you, Caitlin.
Thanks. So I just wanted to take a few minutes. We have a few minutes left, and we'll answer some of the questions that came in. So Vincent, I have two for you, and I think you already answered one a little bit. So one, is your data set shareable? And two, are you planning any follow-up studies? And I know you talked about the County of LA and using their school database.
Yeah, exactly. So unfortunately, the data isn't shareable. It's governed by a very restrictive memorandum of understanding with HUD, and rightfully so. I'm using a lot of household level data that's very confidential, and so I have a lot of protocols and protections in place to even be able to use the data here, and definitely anything that's shared has to be shared at the much more aggregated level to comply with HUD's concerns about anonymity and protecting household information. That said, you know, this is a data set that is something I'm hoping to kind of keep working with and combine with other data to ask important questions. And so I really welcome kind of thoughts and feedback. I'm open to sharing, but naturally I'm constrained by what I'm actually allowed to do. And so with that said, groups to collaborate with, like you said, I'm working with the LAUSD data, and I'm trying to think of other kind of data sets. There are large local administrative data sets that allow you to look at kind of a broader set of outcomes related to income and health and other things. And so I'm hoping to be able to kind of draw those links more specifically. But naturally, the challenge is, what I can allow these data to talk with that still are within the parameters of my data license.
Got it. Thank you. Laurie, I think this one is aimed at you. Do you have any advice for communities looking to start a preservation collaborative or insight onto how those did get started?
Yeah. So short answer, yes. I think it can take a lot of different forms. So we recently wrapped up a project in Miami where we were able to set up exactly what it is that you're talking about. So they came to us actually having seen some of our work in Denver and said, we need to do more preservation. I guess what we need is a preservation ordinance. And we said, hold on, I don't really think you guys are ready for that yet. And so we took a step back and were able to set up actually two sort of these local preservation collaboratives. One just of sort of public sector government partners and allowing them to sort of align their priorities and align their funding streams. And again, it sounds really simple, but sort of just talk to each other about individual properties and how to prioritize those. And then another one being these non-governmental stakeholders, so developers, whether for-profit or nonprofit, as well as advocates, legal aid attorneys, tenants' rights advocates, et cetera, and having them all come around to get together as well to really talk about, what it is they would even want the government to do. Everyone recognized, look, we need to do more preservation, but they weren't sure what they wanted to ask for. So I think the first step is identifying who the right players are, and then getting them in the room together and sort of working together. And again, it sounds really easy. It's not, at least in my experience, and whoever asked this question, I hope you have, I hope it's an easy process for you. But getting those right people in the room together and recognizing that there's a shared interest here can sometimes be, one of the biggest struggles. And then after that, things fall into place a little bit more. We have found that identifying specific tasks for this group has really been a way to keep everyone focused and keep them moving forward with this goal in mind, rather than just saying, okay, we care about preservation, now what? But having a clear set agenda helps, as does having, whether it's one person or one agency, really own the collaborative. So Vincent was telling us how in Philadelphia, it sounds like that was LISC. In Colorado, it's CHAFA, which is the Colorado Housing Finance Agency. In Miami, it's with the Miami-Dade Housing Finance Agency. So whether it's with public or private partners, having someone that really owns that and takes ownership of that process is really key to getting anything done.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And we'll make sure in the notes that we send out the link to the catalog that you were talking about for folks who are interested in starting one of these. But unfortunately, we are out of time and can't take any more questions. But I want to thank everyone for joining the webinar, and a special thank you to our presenters who were so great today and made lots of connections to the different work they're doing. So we'll send out notes from the webinar, and we'll also send out a link to the recording of the webinar. You can look for that in 24 to 48 hours. But that's all we have for today, and have a great rest of your day.
And Caitlin, this is Laura. I'd just offer in the last moments here, whoever, if it was one person, multiple people, anyone interested in this process in their local community can certainly reach out to me, and I'm happy to talk with them further about what may work.
Great. Thank you for that offer.
Yeah, thank you.
All right.